rouge et noir, red and black. Well, this is all telling the story of Jean-Jacques Rousseau and Mrs. Warrens. Well, the affair lasted for a long time. Then he moved in 42 in Paris, and he became a superstar. You know, wherever he was, he had to be a superstar, and he was a superstar in everything. There is just no match. Probably Leonardo da Vinci as somebody who can be compared with Rousseau as a Renaissance man. You know, he knew everything, and he did everything perfectly. I mean, all problematic. Well, in 1962, he publishes two of his major books, and I will talk about them a little later. The big scandals. They have to escape France because he would be in big trouble with the church in particular. But in Switzerland, he doesn't get along very well either. So then he goes to England, returns later to France under an assumed name, and died in 1978. Okay, about Rousseau's work, I skip the first one, which I said is still dealing with sciences and social sciences. The disciplines are not separated from each other. But let me also mention that in 1952, he writes an opera. And he writes a wonderful opera, Le Devin du Village. I have a CD of the opera, and if I would know how to play music, I would show you some of this music. It's great music. Mozart was so excited that he actually wrote an opera following Rousseau's opera. He was in a big, I will talk about this later, I'm a bit obsessed with music. Anyway, he was in big conflict with the greatest French composer ever, Rameau. I'm sure many of you know the work of Rameau, a great 18th century musician. Well, Rousseau was not quite as great a composer as Rameau, but had a debate with him, and his music was to be an alternative to Rameau. Rameau wanted to write French music, and Rousseau was committed to Italian music. Melody, bel canto, right? That's what he loved. And that's what Mozart, in most of his operas, loved. That's why Mozart loved Rousseau rather than Rameau, right? Okay. Then, second book, Discourse of Origins of Inequality, absolutely great book. I don't have the time to work on this. And then in 1962, the two big books you will be reading from, Emile and Social Contract. Emile, 1972, some of the major themes. I mean, he writes about educational philosophy. Those of you who are heading to education, this book is a must, right? You cannot be, right, an educationalist without having read Emile cover to cover, right? This is the foundations of modern educational theory. And he follows the life of a young adult. And the main point is society corrupts, puts all the bad ideas in people's mind. So the real reason of education is to get rid of education, what people got. Well, I can't quite have the ambitions to do it in this course now, to get everything what you learned so far out of your mind and to get the new ideas. But that's what Rousseau thought real education is. Education is negative education. Probably wrong, but very provocative idea, right? And then he is the opposite of Hobbes. Nature is good and foreshadows Marx, who also believed that. Now the social contract. Well, the idea is that legitimate authority has to be authorized by those subjected to authority. And he advocated the first popular sovereignty, right? It has to be done by the majority of man. He actually was not advocating voting rights for women yet, but at least voting rights for all men. But he also suggested that individuals know only their own interest. There must be a state which expresses the general will. We will talk about this a great deal later on. Adam Smith is the next one. Again, you want to be an economist? You have to read The Wealth of Nations cover to cover more than once, right? Otherwise, you are not an economist. So we will be dealing with Adam Smith. Was born in 1723, studied at the University of Glasgow and later in Oxford, became a professor of logic and professor of moral philosophy. Extremely interesting that the most utilitarian economist was a professor of moral philosophy. And in fact, his first book is called The Theory of Moral Sentiments. It is all about ethics rather than rational calculation. And then he travels in France, meets all kind of people, returns to Glasgow, and finally, 76, writes the book, what those of you who are heading into business will have to read, The Wealth of Nations. And he died in 1960. There is two Adam Smiths, one who is talking about the self-interested individuals, who always act rationally, and the individuals pursuing self-interest, fulfill social interest. This is but in the theory of moral sentiment, he is writing about sympathy. He's writing about the helping hand. He's writing about God rather than just business as self-interest. And there has been a library of literature, whether there are two Adam Smiths or whether these complement each other. And there is really one theory and one good economic theory, which is both ethical and rational and calculative. Okay, and this is The Wealth of Nations. Well, one big issue is what he promotes, self-interest, right? People should be acting out of self-interest in order to achieve the common good, and people are the best judge of their interests, not the government, right? Well, this is very much a question for today. Healthcare reform. Do we need the government to tell us what kind of healthcare reforms we need? Adam Smith probably would say, no, you don't need the government. You should judge for yourself what kind of healthcare you want. And then he develops the labor theory of value, that all value is created by labor. He develops in an interesting way, but foreshadows Karl Marx later on. And then, of course, he's known about the idea of the invisible hand. But the invisible hand is not that obvious. He uses the term 3 times in his work, and each time he's using in a different sense. One, it means simply the invisible hand is the free, unregulated market. That's how we normally understand it today. Then he is using it as the hand of God. And then he is actually using it as the hand of Jupiter, right? As the bat hand, as the fate. So we will discuss this a great deal. It's real fun. Okay, then John Stuart Mill, and in fact Harriet Taylor, who is a companion later wife, very important for his work. Well, he was born in London and was actually brought up by Jeremy Bentham. Jeremy Bentham is the theorist who created what later was coined by John Stuart Mill, utilitarianism. The idea, the central idea of Bentham's work is that we are all of us seeking pleasure and try to avoid pain. That's what explains human behavior. Utility this is what we want to avoid. And the correct action is to maximize pleasure and minimize pain. Mill had a nervous breakdown in 1926. He found Bentham theory too oppressive. He met also Mrs. Harriet Friedman, who was married at that time and had an interesting triangle, Mr. Taylor, Mrs. Taylor, and Mill, until Mr. Taylor died, and that's when they actually got married. Harriet Taylor was quite a feminist and had a big impact on the thinking of John Stuart Mill. Harriet died, unfortunately, very early, and Mill later on wrote his most important book after Harriet's death, but probably greatly influenced by Harriet Taylor. Now, his work, he established a utilitarian society, but eventually became a revisionist because I will explain it in a minute, because he said there are really higher values which are also utilities, rather than just seeking pleasures. He wrote on liberty, on utilitarianism,